Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
So, welcome again to the Lighthouse Dialogue. My name is Saide van der Leeuw, and I am the project manager of Science and Wisdom Live. The Lighthouse Dialogues is a new series of events organized in collaboration with Jamyang Buddhist Center London and Science and Wisdom Live. And for this series, author Vicki MacKenzie interviews spiritual lighthouses, by which we mean experienced contemplative practitioners whose wisdom and compassion could function as a lighthouse, a beacon of light and understanding for our society. The interviews will be focused on the inner experience of people who have dedicated their lives to genuine spiritual search, service, and meditation. That's because we believe that the inner values and qualities developed through lifelong contemplative practice can be profoundly healing for our society and help us move beyond the crisis that our world is facing today. And today it's our honor to welcome John Butler to the Lighthouse Dialogues. So in the 1970s, John Butler became known as one of the first organic farmers. Having throughout his life also practiced meditation, 4 years ago, at the age of 79, he was recommended to Conscious TV, a YouTube channel, which was a big hit. And soon after his debut there, John developed the YouTube channel Spiritual Unfoldment together with Phil Shankland, which presently has over 200,000 subscribers and 15 million views. Though brought up with Christianity and familiar with it, John follows no particular teaching, but speaks entirely from his own experience, using examples from nature and simple common sense. Liking the name Mr. Nothing, he suggests to his followers, feel your feet on the ground, listen and look. And if this is practiced with attention, this brings the mind to rest in silence, which may then expand into stillness or peace, spaciousness, freedom, and an abiding sense of spiritual presence. The traditional religious teaching that the Lord is with us then becomes to come into a real life experience. And it's also my honor to introduce Vicki MacKenzie, who is a British national journalist and author. And in 1976, while working on the Daily Mail, she stumbled into her first Buddhist meditation course at Kopan in Nepal. This led to an ongoing journey into Buddhism, resulting in many articles for the Sunday Times, the Observer, the Sunday Telegraph, and also she has written several books, which are including Cave in the Snow, Reincarnation, the Boy Lama, and also The Revolutionary Life of Freda Bedi, British feminist, Indian nationalist, and Buddhist nun. So now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Vicki to start this interview. Over to you, Vicki.
Thank you very much, Saida. Yes, it's a great honour and delight to interview John Butler. I had the great good fortune to actually meet him in person a few weeks ago in his hometown of Bakewell near Sheffield, and saw the environment in which he lived and heard him speak and had a really, really enjoyable time, so that I could really get to know him a little bit in person rather than this impersonal medium of Zoom and technology. So my attention was first brought to John Butler when I heard about him, and I clicked on to one of his broadcasts, and what struck me first of all was his voice. It's soothing, it's calming, and it is full of some kind of very benign knowing and power. And then I thought, well, no wonder that he has managed at the age of, in his early 80s, no wonder he has managed to captivate, these 15 million views and becoming a kind of YouTube phenomena very late in life. And he really soothed so many people during COVID and lockdown with his broadcasts. And so I thought he would be the most excellent candidate for our Lighthouse Dialogues, because John really has been a lighthouse, not just with his voice, but with his wisdom, through these really traumatic, for many people, and uncertain and anxiety-making days. And I thought it was no wonder, actually, that even Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, gave him an award for this, his Points of Light Award, in November of 2021, for an award which recognises outstanding individuals who make a difference. So I became completely enchanted, I have to admit, with John Butler, and looked more into him and how he came to be the man and the figure he is today, and how he's managed to help so many people internationally, not just in this country, obviously, but around the world. So what I have learned about John, just from my very brief encounter with him, is that he is basically a mystic. He is guided by voices and his intuition, and as he said, his common sense. And his whole teaching, if you like, is based on experience rather than dogma, which I find is a very, very powerful avenue into especially the ordinary man and woman and child and everything in the street, because you don't have to be a philosopher or an academic or a great intellectual. So John reaches people very, 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 very near and far by his absolute sincerity. So John's way is the way of the heart. And he says that this is the way which is much more important rather than a lot of clever words. And I couldn't agree more. So he also said, put it in a nutshell, that the three things which have influenced him is nature, common sense, and meditation. So John, I'm going to start off with two questions, really. The first one is, how did nature get you onto the spiritual path? And how did it get you into meditation? I'm going to actually come back to the nature aspect later. So maybe how the nature was the starting point for your journey into meditation. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on how you got into meditation through your love of nature and your feeling that nature could actually make the world a better place.
Well, Vicki, I was very fortunate. My mother bore me on a spring morning with cherry blossom outside the window in a lovely country setting, nowhere near hospitals or any of that. So I grew up with it. I grew up with grass and sunshine, and well, the cherry blossom passed, but then came the cherries and just the familiar trees and bushes and grass that surrounded me. This was my life. I knew nothing else. I was born before the war, and then the war broke out when I was 2 years old, and virtually all social life, not that I ever had any social life, sort of ended then. We were very isolated. I hardly knew what another little boy was throughout my childhood. Never heard of football, or hardly knew what a motor car was. There was a farm nearby that I used to love to go to. Of course, they still had horses then. and farm horses, work horses, and of course I adored these, and sheep and cows. So these were my natural brothers and sisters, really. I did have an older sister, but she tended to play more with a couple of girls that lived a few fields away. So I was very, very much alone, and never felt I was alone. Didn't know what loneliness was as a child, because I had surrounded by all my little friends of nature, my rabbit and my lizard, and our dog, of course. I was used to being quiet. I never was much of a talker. So that's how nature got in first, long before I'd ever heard of a spirit or had any interest in spirit. I'm just soaked in nature.
Lovely. And then I believe you went off to Peru with a kind of altruistic motivation of like saving the planet by. So tell us a little bit about what happened when you went to Peru and your dream of saving the world through saving the planet through nature.
Well, I was one of those lucky children that always knew what I wanted to do. In fact, I used to say to my mother, so she says, that I came into this world to be a farmer. I don't know how I knew that, but that's what I said, apparently, as I was a little boy. And I've always been a farmer. I loved farming. And, of course, this was long before the days of chemicals and machinery, before that, the industrial farming, as we know it today, when farming was farming. It was more way of life than the business then. And when I grew up in my early 20s, I began to sort of think a bit more broadly, and at that time we were beginning to hear something about what was then called the Third World. And I remember there was some advertisements appeared then of little starving children, which really opened a window to many people like myself who never really thought much about any other countries. And anyway, as part of it, I think really I was more interested in soil erosion then, and they were offering grants of 1,000 hectares of Bolivian jungle to anybody who'd go and develop it. And I thought I'd go off and do this. I'd take my axe with me and fell the jungle. Of course, it wasn't a bad thing to do. It seemed a good thing to do, and grow food for hungry people, you see. But that didn't quite work out. But I ended up in Peru, and got into. I was going to reforest the Andes, which were badly eroded, and I knew a bit about soil erosion, and so I started a little project to reforest the Andes, and didn't get on too badly there, but also did not too well. And am I wandering off your point, Vicki? I'm a bit inclined to do this. Anyway, there was one notable occasion sitting on a mountain top, sort of pondering my success, failure, and a little voice seemed to say to me, to make whole, be whole, to make whole, be whole, which of course I didn't understand at the time, but I had not long previously read a book about meditation, not that I knew what it was, but anyway, when my time in Peru ended and I came home, I looked for and found a school of meditation, and immediately, I'm wandering off. Do you want to? Sorry, let me come back to you. You guide me in what you want me to say. Otherwise, I'll waffle on forever.
Okay. Well, I mean, you told me that it was the School of Meditation in Holland Park, and that it was basically mantra-based. Have I understood that correctly?
Correct. Yes.
And you were terribly diligent. And did it immediately click, or did it take a while to click for you?
No, I took to it like a duck to water. It was ever so natural. And we were told the school was quite sternly organised, and we were told this was really required of us do, it was just quarter of an hour, night and morning regularly, which I did. And I've practiced twice a day ever since, really all my life. Of course, I do longer now. But that's how I started. And the very first practice I did was in St Pancras Station waiting room, because I had to get the late night train back again, because I had already started farming to feed my animals. And I sat in that dingy, unconducive place, you'd think, late at night, and did my first practice. And it all opened up like that. And I suddenly realized I didn't have to go all the way to South America to find mountains and the wide open spaces. It was all within me. And
wonderful.
And very, very soon after that, because of course this space is invisible, it's silent, I realized that this actually is what the Bible calls spirit, and what I'd been taught at school. You know, they taught about spirit, but I didn't know what it was. Nobody would explain to me what it was. And suddenly I realized meditation made spirit practical, a practical experience that I could just experience just like that. Like I can look out of the window and see the trees.
So, John, can I just interrupt you a little bit? So what do you think it was on the mantra? Do you think it was sound? Do you think it was this? Because you weren't saying it out loud, I presume. You were saying the mantra internally. Do you think it was sound that gave you this immediate opening up to spirit?
I don't know what it was, Vicki. I don't know, but it's gone on happening ever since. It just seems natural.
It's a natural thing. So you mean you've kept at it diligently, I think for over 60 years now, haven't you, John? And I was very impressed because I came with you. You go into you wake up very early in the morning at 4:30, and you've got a key, haven't you? They've given you a key to the church. And you go in there every morning for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening.
Yes.
And so, I mean, this seems like a very obvious question, but, well, A, have you developed? And secondly, what does it give you? What does it mean? Because it's a very, very long time, and you have been so diligent, and so disciplined. So there has to be something in it for you. I'm talking now for the people who are listening and watching this, because most of us fall by the wayside very, very early, but something must have been so strong for you that it's kept you at it.
Well, it's easy. It's love.
Can you explain a little bit?
Who knows what love is? Like all real things in life, it cannot be explained.
So you mean from the very beginning, you from the very first time you felt love from when you meditated?
Vicki, dear, we jumped the first 20 years of my life.
Yes, I know. I'm coming back to that. I haven't forgotten that.
In which I didn't really explain my love of not being fenced in or wide open spaces.
So please explain about because as I've wanted to say, is that your path has been very much the path of love. So please explain, yes.
I'm used to the open fields, both as a child and as a farmer. So I've loved the open fields, and which of course are quiet, aren't they?
Yes.
I'm alone in the open fields. There are no people there. It's just the open fields, the sky, the infinite sky above, and Mother Earth beneath. And so that's what I love naturally. That's home. That's where I belong. And in contrast, not that I have that much experience of the big city and crowds of people, but enough to know that I prefer the wide open spaces. And certainly I've become I'm more tolerant now as an old man, but certainly as a young man, I love that without question. And the marvelous thing about meditation is that even meditating in the middle of London, I could access this silent space.
Right. Okay.
And so the great comfort of my life, which is as I learned more about spirit, I began to realize that there's this marvelous sequence, which is silence, which is stillness, because silence is still. What is it? And then space. Well, where does one end and the other begin? Aren't they all really the same thing? Silence, stillness, space. Peace. There is peace. It's just this, isn't it? It's just the space, the silence. And we're in it like fishes in the sea. We can never not be at peace. How can anybody not? But we don't see it. You see, this is the problem. We get locked into this agitated state of mind and miss what's in front of our noses. Even more than in front of our noses is what keeps us, what contains us. This ocean of peace. And then develop that a bit longer. Peace, presence, love, spirit, God. Where does one end and the other begin? It's all just one thing. It's just that, it gets a bit difficult to talk about God straight away because people get put off by it. But if you just talk about silence, it's so simple. There's no argument about silence, no contention there. But this is just the forerunner, as it were, of a deepening awareness of silence, deeper and deeper into silence. It's like going into the sky. How far do you go into the sky? There's no end to it, is there? Look up at the stars and there's no end. So it is with spirit. It's just exactly the same. And you find this within yourself and just, it has no end. It is the great adventure without end. Yeah. And I've always been an adventurer. I've had some terrific adventures in this life, but this is the great adventure that never fails. It just gets better and better. and you see, of course, again, I'm talking as an old man now, but all our failures and just sort of the restrictions and the things that don't work out in this life, you really find are all perfectly fulfilled in spirit. But that's rather a long story. It's taken me a long time to realize that, but that's the effect of it. So how can I not love meditation, which is really, in the confusion of life, honestly, one of the best things you can possibly do is just look out of the window. Because the moment you look out of the window, there's the sky, isn't there? And the sky is completely untroubled by what's going on in the world. The sky is just there, this eternal reassurance just beaming down on us. Well, see, meditation is really just looking out of the window within one's own mind.
John, you make it sound so simple, and I think you have been exceptional in how quickly you managed to achieve this state. But I'd like to give some encouragement to the people who are listening to this and watching this. But one has to start slowly and take it, and not really, and be kind to oneself. Just keep going slowly, and maybe not have instant results. What do you think?
Oh, it's absolutely essential. Don't look for results. Yes, it's most important principle of meditation. Yes. Don't look for results, because all you're doing is projecting some idea of your own. But all results are futile, because the real result can't be described. See, how can you describe freedom? How can you describe spirit?
Yes.
Nobody can. It's beyond it, because description belongs to a very little thing called duality. If you describe something, it's not something else, is it? Yes. So it's always misleading to get bogged down in results.
Yes. And we compare, don't we, all the time?
Oh, yes, that's hopeless. There's all this exercise of the mind. Yes. And don't worry about thoughts either in meditation. People spend lifetimes trying to figure out their thoughts. It's whatever for. To me, I like to think of Sorry, again, I'm waffling on, Vicki.
No. Carry waffling.
Stop me if I go off the point.
No.
But you see, to me, thinking is rather like our tummies, the way our tummies digest our food, depending. Sometimes we put the wrong things in our tummies, we get tummy ache, don't we, or indigestion.
Yes.
And the mind's really just a digestive system for the mind. It's the same sort of process. And I can talk to you quite happily. Don't even think about my tummy, do I?
Yeah.
Well, the same thing with the mind. When you meditate, you just ignore it. You just go through it, and discover the freedom on the other side. It's like an aeroplane. You see, on a cloudy day, you live beneath the clouds, and you just get under the weather, as it were.
Yeah.
But then you get in an aeroplane. Once you got through the airport, you sit back, and what happens? You go through the clouds. And what's beyond the clouds? Freedom, isn't it? Open sky. Well, that's meditation. Perfect meditation. And so you're given the method of meditation is just like an airplane. It just takes you through the clouds. So you just use your method, whatever it is, and you don't jump out of the airplane, do you? No, of course you don't. So you don't stay with the practice of the meditation, whether you've got a mantra or whatever you're doing, singing or looking at a candle or something, breathing. Just do that. If you do it attentively, you're not interested in your thoughts. You go beyond. Of course, not everybody wants freedom. A lot of people love their thoughts. We're so obsessed with our me, our self-centeredness, self-righteousness, self-everything, that actually we prefer to wallow around in that.
Yes.
And indeed, you can spend a lifetime wallowing around in your head, going around in circles. Well, that's okay if that's what you want. If you want the big stuff, if you want freedom, you're going to find something better, haven't you?
That's right. John, I'd like to ask you, what is your definition of God?
I don't know. Nobody knows what God is. How can you define God? If I defined God, I'd just put God in a little box. And then God wouldn't be something else, would he? How can anybody define God? How can anyone define freedom or love even, or peace or silence? None of the real things in life can be defined.
But I read that you defined him once, and I thought it was wonderful because it tallies a lot with Buddhism. I think you called him special consciousness or unobstructed consciousness or something.
I don't know if I ever said that. I never knew what consciousness was until after we're in this school where I was taught to meditate. I'd never heard of all this spiritual language when I started to meditate. And then gradually this word consciousness was introduced, and it took me ages to figure out what they were talking about, to understand what it was. I think eventually I got the idea that it's silence, but I'm not sure if that's right.
Yes.
So I don't really like using these long words, Vicki.
Yes.
I'd rather keep simple.
Yes.
But I think of all the various descriptions of God I have heard of, one of the ones that appealed to me most was absolute simplicity. Yes, I like that, because it's just in a way like silence amplified into the infinite, isn't it? Well, silence is infinite, but it's infinite, isn't it? And there's absolutely no division. It's just, people use words like one and absolute one. Well, what would be just words, aren't they? I know what it is, darling. It's like going up on the hill, and you just look at the space. What's that?
John, I noticed that in your flat, that you had lots and lots of icons, which I like very much, of Mary and the child.
Yeah.
And in amongst them was one picture of Ramana Maharshi, who I used to read about and study. So I wonder if you could just say a couple of words about the relevance to you of those two figures, the icon of Mary and also Ramana Maharshi.
Well, I was blessed to spend several years in Russia, and where I learned a lot about. It was like discovering Christianity for a second time, because it's, in Russia they have what's called orthodoxy.
Yes.
It's really got quite a different understanding to at least modern day Western understanding of the faith. And I learned a lot there, for which I'm very grateful. And orthodoxy puts great emphasis on saints. It has saint for every possible place and person, almost personality. And they're very instructive, because they're like examples of how to live that sort of life. And the Russian orthodoxy is primarily what's called by scholars, I think, Marian, or whatever the word is. Anyway, it's based on the mother.
Right.
See, Russia is considered the Holy Mother Russia, Mother Russia, and all Russian culture is very much mother orientated. And it's said that that particular famous icon you may have noticed in my flat, called Vladimirskaya icon, enshrines the spirit of Russia, and I've no doubt it does. And tears are part of it. The mother's tears. This is integral to a Russian understanding of life. Yes, the story of Mary, Mary grieving for her son. So my few years of Russia, yes, brought icons into my life. I was never much of one for symbols and that, but I learned what I could when I was in Russia, and learned to love icons. And the other thing you mentioned was, what was the other thing?
Ramana Maharshi.
I think I was just in a bookshop one day. I'd never heard of him, and I noticed I think there was a picture of him with a cow, and of course, being a farmer, loving cows, I picked that up and looked, and then I read that he didn't say very much. So those two things endeared him to me.
I see.
That he taught by just sitting silently and loved cows. That was enough for me, and I didn't bother too much about anything else really. But I did get one or two little books and read him and loved what he wrote. It seemed to very much echo what I felt myself. So I've always felt a sort of that's sympathy.
Well, at the risk of prompting you, which I'm going to, he talked a lot about the self, didn't he? And I wondered, yes, and it's quite. I studied him too. I was very attracted to him as well, and it took me a long time, because Buddhism talks about no self. So I was quite conflicted about Ramana's talking about it and my teachings about self, and I think I've understood it much more now. It doesn't mean that you're kind of egocentric, does it? I mean,
no, that's exactly that. What I couldn't, when I first heard of the self in that sense, I with consciousness, it took me ages to try to understand what it meant.
Yeah,
they were talking about, and I never use the word myself. It's not part of my vocabulary.
right.
I don't really like it, and if Ramana Maharshi used the word, well, it didn't make any impression on me really.
Okay.
People use the self to indicate higher reality. Well, I don't really think very much like that. this morning I went out for a walk through the meadows around here, and there was a group of young cattle, and I was ever so touched that I just stood still, and they came close to me, and I just love that. And that, in a way, means more to me than all this talk about self-realization, all that sort of thing. I suppose for me, it's love has always been, in a way, the direct link to what one might call God. And yes, I'd much rather think of Ramana Maharshi really with his arm around a cow's neck than talking about self something or other. What do we mean by it all? Yes, I can talk about it. I've lived long enough and had enough experience now to know what people mean by it. But devotion is devotion. It's devotion, dear. No. Jesus didn't talk about the self, did he?
No.
It's become sort of fashionable in today's sort of spiritual language, but I'm not a very modern person. I'm rather old-fashioned. I feel I don't really belong in this world of self-realization. maybe I've come in by the back door. I'm not sure. That's for others to judge.
I was very moved watching one of your broadcasts, John, when you just naturally called yourself Mr. Nobody.
Yes, well, that makes sense to me. The less of me, the more of God. Well, I began to learn that as a young farmer, that when I began to realize that the less I interfered, the better things went. Nature knew better than I did.
Yes.
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 And after all, what is close to God? Oh, aren't the animals? And what's the difference? The animals don't talk about me, do they, all the time? They're not bothered about making judgments of other people. They're marvelously. Oh, what could... Yeah. Jesus calls himself the good shepherd. And I remember, as a young man, I think, yes, I know, when I was still in Peru and was coming home and didn't really know what to do with myself, and I thought I'll try to be a good shepherd like Jesus, literally a good shepherd, not with my people, but with sheep. So I bought myself a flock of sheep when I came home and started farming sheep. And I've always felt sheep are among the greatest teachers, because they're so humble, pure souls. And if you asked me how I've got a quiet voice, I could say from talking to sheep, maybe.
That's lovely. But John, you've also had some very hard times in your life.
Yes.
You've had 20, I think it was 20 years when you were lonely and felt loveless and had depression. Looking back on that now, what do you think that was about, and how did you come out of it?
Well, I'm not sure I've ever come out of it. Yeah, it's not just 20 years. I think I've been lonely all my life. I think if there's one adjective that has persisted since I was first sent to boarding school at the age of 7 into the company of other little boys, I think almost, I'm not sure that I've lost it even completely, even now. I've been lonely. I've never really found that total companionship in this life. I've never really found a company of a human organization where I felt I could belong. Mm. I suppose Mother was Russian. She was a refugee from the Russian Revolution in the 1920s, and it was only when I went to Russia that I felt among my own people, really. I think those are among the happiest years of my life, really, in Russia. I felt I belonged there. People there thought and felt as I did. But I wouldn't say it entirely sort of purged me of this loneliness. Yes, I think this loneliness has been this craving for total love. And in human experience, one doesn't often find, in my experience, the totality of love. And that's what I've always longed for. There was always something missing in the love experiences I've had. And I longed for more. I longed for the stars. Mm. And so I've lived with loneliness all my life. And meditation, funnily enough, I think another occasion, I spent some time in the deserts in Africa, in Namibia and Kalahari. And I know quite a lot about deserts. And I think those are among the most not lonely times of my life, completely alone under the stars in the desert. I think there I felt closer to, I suppose, the infinite love that I longed for. Yes, indeed I have. Yes, and I wrote a book about it. It's called Mystic Naturally in Africa. I remember describing that sense of being absorption into total love under the desert stars. Beautiful experience. And yet, bring it down to human context, it's never big enough. That's what I've found. I've longed for the totality of it. This self-abandonment, total self-abandonment into infinite love. And I suppose if you want me to sort of bring that back to meditation, this has really been what my motive in meditation is. Self-abandonment. Yes, I think that describes it very well. The self-abandonment to love, to freedom, to love primarily.
You have a new book coming out called Of Mystic Union.
Yes, I have actually. I'll go down. Yeah. This is the last of my 10 books, and you could say, in fact, it's the final chapter. When I think the duality of I love you, which somehow never fully works out, is finally dissolved in realizing that when men and women come together of course, in this world of physical, appearance, we're all separate. And in meditation, as you gradually develop insight, you learn to see not with these physical eyes, which are really the eyes of death, the eyes of mortality. You don't see anything really with this. These eyes are spiritual blindness. And these ears are spiritual deafness. As you access the upper air in meditation, then you begin to the invisible, the silent world then begins to come into reality. It seems nothing from down here, but the more you immerse yourself in it, the more real it becomes. As a farmer, it was the fairies. That was what was real. The sense of the nature spirits. That could sit on a flower without hurting it, whereas I couldn't. See my clumsy feet crushed in daisies, and the fairy could sit on it without hurting it. Why can't I be like a fairy, you see? Mm-hmm. And yes, in meditation, in spirit, you realize that in spirit you can live in spirit without hurting anything, without hurting anyone. And the love of spirit is completely without demands. It's just totally all-embracing, embracing the whole world without limit. And of course, being human, I've spent my life, in the I love you level of love.
Yes.
Usually the trouble is she doesn't love me, isn't it? That's the trouble. But doesn't love me enough the way I want it. But as we dwell ever more in spirit, and this is what's marvelous about dying out, you see, because the impediment, which is this mortality, dies out, then spirit becomes takes over, as it were, ever more, and it becomes ever more obvious that real life is spirit. And in spirit, of course, there are no men and women, it's all one. And when you pass through the Adam and Eve phase, it's all one. And then you go beyond that into the total one. And there, ultimately, your love problems come to an end because it's like waking up from a dream. They never were. As it was this appearance, you see, of man and woman that we get hung up on. And why we all have these endless problems in this world. But when we come back home to spirit, which of course is where we come from originally, then this whole bad dream of mortality, mortal existence, literally dies out, and with it the problems.
Yes.
So this is what I describe in this book of Mystic Union, which is, as you see, isn't printed yet, but hopefully it will be one day. And then for those that are interested.
Yes. So you are not fearful of death, or you probably don't even wonder if anything is going to happen at all.
Well, I don't know. Nobody really knows for sure. But I think meditation is rather like dying. I've always thought that. Yes,
Really?
Because when you meditate, well, very soon after people practice, I've taught countless people to meditate. I know enough about it to know that very often, almost the very first time they meditate, where was I? What happened? You know. They forget about their bodies, don't they? And they even forget about their thoughts for a few moments.
Yes.
So what happens? It's no really big deal just to sort of go out of the body and grow into what's beyond the body.
Yes.
I mean, we forget about the body when we go to sleep every night, don't we?
Yeah.
Pick it up again in the morning. But
Yes.
again, sorry, I've waffled off on.
No. I think
What you asked.
no. I think that's wonderful. I mean, we could go on chatting forever, but I feel I should give some other people maybe a chance to, if they've got any questions, to ask them, because I could waffle on as well forever, John, and talk about the purpose of life and why are we here then, and we could get into very interesting or boring, with your probably, your view, but there are lots of wonderful questions. So you've answered beautifully. Thank you. So maybe I could hand it back to Saida now and see if anybody's got any questions.
So actually my question, John, is I was very struck by what you said about your experience in Russia.
Yes, I heard that, yes.
Yeah, and your encounter with Orthodox Christianity.
Yes.
And it felt to me as if you were sort of you were going back to the roots of Christianity and your own upbringing and understanding in that. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the icon that you also have in your house of Maria and her child, and how to interpret that from a more mystical point of view. Because I've heard people explaining this as a symbol for spiritual growth inside ourselves, that actually it's something that we can nurture as a child inside ourselves and then grows into something which actually encompasses us and shares with us. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience in Russia and how these icons maybe came to life for you or got a different meaning for you.
Yeah, you're rather trying to get me into unfamiliar territory, trying to get me into the world of explaining. And I'm not very good at explaining things. I don't really work that way in my head very well. For me, as I tried to say to Vicki, it's more an emotional process. Now, tears are very highly esteemed in Russia. And if I was to In fact, in my book about Russia, I put on the back cover, "What have you given me, O Russia?" And my eyes are filled with tears. That's what you've given me, my dear, the gift of tears. Now then, in the West, we rather dismiss tears and are a bit sort of dismissive of emotional. People say, "I got emotional," as if there's something to apologize about. Now, it's quite different in Russia. People that are able to express their emotions are admired. In fact, almost nobody can't express their emotions. It's a very different world, a very different culture from England. And when I went to see that original icon that I told you about, like almost everybody that I knew who'd been there, I just stood and cried. What else can you do, dear? I couldn't care less about philosophic explanations. She just works on the heart. And even before I went to Russia, I met, there's a man called Malcolm Muggeridge, I remember, who was a well-known man at the time, broadcaster. He told me he'd just been to Russia, to Kiev actually. No, it was part of the Soviet Union then. And described Russians throwing themselves at God in prayer. And that just meant the world to me. That's exactly how I meditate, always have done. And how I feel I want to approach God, dear. I'm not interested in explanations. I just want that total love, self-abandonment to divinity, to what is bigger than me. I don't even like words like divinity, it's words, to what is bigger and more wonderful than me, to what pulls my heart, to what brings me to tears. That to me is a true instinct, which speaks much deeper, more meaningfully than verbal explanations of things, really. Well, I can do that too, if pushed. But I put this in first place. And I condemn the experience of, I could talk a long time about this because I've got a big 2-volume book written about Russia called Mystic Forbearance, which is just what, because God knows what Russia's endured throughout this last century. If only the West knew the half of it, but we don't. And forbearance, how is this forbearance one? It's one, and perhaps the greatest quality that was admired in Russia is humility. Because humility takes you where nothing else does, and humility is the stepping stone to the less of me, the more of God. And that's really it. The less of me, the more of God. That's it.
Thank you, John. Wow. Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. There is another question. So it's being asked, what do you recommend for people who can't access nature? It seems to be such an important therapy, but hard to reach if you live in a big city. And this person is asking, some people spend their whole childhoods without leaving the concrete jungle. So what would you advise to those people?
It's a difficult one, that, Sadia, isn't it? What can they do? Well, thank God there's the sky. It's sometimes hard to see it in the city. There's usually a tree or two. You can look at the tree. Most people even have a window box or a flower in a pot, don't they? It's sort of desperate. Reach out to something real, or a little pussy cat or something, little dog. All these things are lifelines, aren't they? Get out to the country as much as you can. Yes, it is a tragic deprivation, and I feel very sorry for people that don't have that basic grounding in Mother Earth. You probably heard me often say There's one of the best introductions to meditation. It's a way of meditation itself. Just feel your feet on the ground. Even in a high-rise block of flats, the floor is still, isn't it? So if you want to access peace, put your feet on the floor. Not only put them on the floor, but actually feel them. This makes the difference. People will say, oh, I do. My feet are on the floor. Of course they're not. You're not aware of it. But to be aware, 100% of your feet on the floor, my dear, you'll then suddenly all that I'm talking about will be obvious to you. Because we are so inattentive in our heads, we're so absent-minded in our heads that we never hardly know what it is to feel the presence of something bigger than ourselves, even the presence of silence, let alone the presence of God. But if we only have 1% of attention on our feet, it'll be a step in the right direction. And with much practice, we might get 5% of our attention on our feet, or even 6 or 7%. You're doing very well if you attend to your feet with 10%. And if you can do it with 100%, then you're on the way to sanctity. You probably are already there. It's all to do with this crazy minds of ours, uncontrolled agitation in the mind, and then a simple exercise like that will connect us. And that, in a way, is being natural, isn't it? Because our problem is we're so unnatural. But just being attentive will solve an awful lot of problems. Let's go into the supermarket and give attention to the vegetables. See how beautiful they are. Even in the supermarket, they're still alive. Consider their life. If you buy an apple or eat it or something, ow! Can't you feel the apple saying ow? Well, if you can't, try it again, and be attentive, and you'll find that you're eating into something living. If somebody took a bite of your finger, you'd say ow, wouldn't you? Is the apple any different? It can't jump away from you. But it doesn't mean to say it's without feelings, dear. Every lettuce, everything is alive. Every potato is alive. God, I didn't half learn this lesson as a farmer. You do. You're dealing with living creatures. We just about, it took us a long time to recognize that slaves were human. And then we gradually began to think of children as human, and now women as human too. Well, the next step is to think of, some people do think of animals as living creatures and try their best to look after them. Well, the next step is to look after the vegetables and the fruit and the grains that feed us. They're less alive than anything else, are they? You see, you hardly know what I'm talking about. But if you want to know how to meditate, if you want to know how to progress on the spiritual path, there you are. That would be a very good start. A lot more use to you than reading a lot of books, I can tell you that. Because this is real. Otherwise, you're just getting something out of somebody else's head.
Thank you. Yes, and it's true that even in cities, there's a lot of nature around, right? So just looking at some birds and bees in a park, or there's always a lot of resources of nature around. I had a second question, which I can ask, I think. So the second question was about what you mentioned, John, about the total self-abandonment and the experience of love, as you called it.
Oh, sorry, darling, say again.
You mentioned the total self-abandonment in the experience of love. Yeah. And that's really struck me as a very beautiful way to describe this sense of unity and interdependence that you described earlier.
Yes.
And it's brought me back to childhood memory, actually. I grew up on a small island in the Netherlands. Yes. And had an experience like that when I was swimming in the sea with very high waves. And suddenly realized that I could just relax and float on top of the water instead of swim. and I was really part of that ocean, that feeling of the sea.
Yes.
And I was wondering, like, what about for me, that experience had to do with an initial fear that I had to overcome and release. Yes. And so my question is, what do you think about your own experiences, your spiritual experiences in life? Did they have something to do with certain obstacles that you had to take and to actually overcome? And did that bring you, in a way, into a place that made it more accessible to then go into this feeling of unity and interdependence and space that you were describing?
You know, in over 60 years of meditation, I've never had a bad or frightening experience, not once. It's a journey of love, little love, my little love to great love. That's what it is. Come unto me, says Jesus. Holds out his arms. Come unto me. The only difficulties we encounter are in this life, are in what's called the ego. That sense of that we are separate, which of course we all are, we all have and are. That's why I've got a separate body. This is why it dies. The body dies, but it's separate from God. So this is where we have difficulties, and of course they're very, very difficult indeed. And maybe that's why we're given 80 years of this life to struggle with it all and try to deal with it. A lot of people want to sort it out straight away, and it doesn't usually work like that. It's a long, 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 lifelong practice. You've got to be patient and struggle on. And yes, there are reasons why we don't want to do it. Other things, diversions of this world. You need to. It helps to have a clear thing in mind, what you want, what you really, really want most. A lot of people come with very weak intention. It's just fashionable. It's the latest thing to do. People have some woolly idea in their mind about spirit, whatever it is. But you've got to want it, my dear. Otherwise, you're hardly likely to stay the course. You've got to want it. You know how it's written in the first commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, with all thy mind and with all thy strength. And there you are. And him only shalt thou serve. Well, how many come to meditation with that attitude? And again, quoting from the Bible, think of the many stories of the sower, for example, going out to sow the seed, and some fell by the wayside and was trodden down, and some was eaten by the birds, and others were choked by the weeds, the cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and bring no fruit to perfection. You see, it's all written there in the good book, and that's how it is. So many start with enthusiasm, and then they lack the motivation to persist when things get difficult, which they will, I assure you. It's like falling in love, dear. The honeymoon's marvelous, and then you come home to the nitty-gritty of it. It's not so easy.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about those difficulties?
About the physical?
The difficulties.
The difficulties.
These difficulties.
Well, I've just told you the cares and riches and pleasures of this life. Probably one of the main ones. The kingdom of God is not of this world. That's a big pill to swallow, because people think it is. On one hand, you're trying to save this world, and on the other hand, you're trying to save your soul. Well, the spirit is not this physical world. But people get very confused about it, and try to sort of ride two horses at the same time. I did. And it's only really at the very, very end of the journey that we might experience it coming together in one ultimate union. Most of life, it's not like that at all. There's this pull of the world and the pull of what's called the pull of the way, the pull of the call to the infinite. This world is not infinite. It's very, very finite, isn't it? It has limits. How do you reconcile the limited with the unlimited? Black and white, isn't it? Yes, there are many, many ways of dealing with these, or the dark forces, darkness and light. It's the age-old spiritual struggle, isn't it? All this goes on within ourselves. What is the darkness? That's the ego, of course. The works of darkness, the devil in us, and that is at war with this yearning for spirit, for God. And this is in every person, and so don't be surprised at what happens, what we encounter on the way. Yes, there are explanations for it all. Like again, I could talk forever on this, but I've had a lot of experience. But this life isn't a joyride, my dears. Those of you that start meditation will probably have more difficulties than most others, because you'll then take on more of the troubles of this world. Like Jesus bore the whole. Why, as it said, he bore our sins. Well, once you begin to understand what that means, you'll understand why those that take the long, hard road of meditation will end up carrying an ever greater burden. We've all got to be crucified in our own mini way. It's serious, isn't it? It's big stuff. We don't realize when we start what it's really all about. But I think that's why I've always felt the reassurance of looking up at the sky. I get up very early in the morning. I go up to the church, and of course, for most of the year, it's dark at that time. And I love to pause just outside the church, look up at the sky, at my little brothers, the stars. Not so little, are they? Big brothers, the stars. Feel the greatness of it all. What is man, little man, honestly? What is man? What do we add up to? Just a puff. Look at me now, an old man. In a little while I'll be dead, just dust, gone to dust. What's it all about? What's it all been for? And thank God if you start spiritual work, if you start meditating, when you're young, as you did, you've done some preparation. And you might have learned something you can take with you beyond the grave. That's a good thing. If you keep that in mind, that sorts out what's useful and what's useless. What can you take beyond the grave? It's big stuff. And then expand that to the whole world, you see. The world is come back to using this word sin, which is a very useful word to describe absence from the presence of God. In the presence of God, which is spirit, of course, there is no death, is there? No death, no suffering, no sign. It's light. So where does darkness come from? It all comes from the separation, see, from the light, which is, in personal terms, is the ego. And this fights for its existence. Once it feels threatened, which it does when you meditate, it comes back with even greater force. What about me? What about me? Poor me. Oh, that's a difficult one, darlings. You don't deal with that one overnight. That's a lifelong struggle. But thank God there are ways. There are ways, and I think he may, I don't know if he'll ever get rid of it, but he may get a bit less.
Thanks so much, John. I think that's a very beautiful place to end, actually. Unless, Vicki, do you have another question? Or, yeah.
No, John, you ended it just perfectly. Thank you. Really, really precious what you've given us.
Thank you. Is that it then?
Yes. Thank you both so much for all this wisdom that you have shared with us today. And also, Vicki, for your amazing questions, as always, to draw that out in little jewels. So I think, just speaking for myself, I feel always very uplifted if I listen to people like yourself, John. It feels as if we're a little bit, like you said, that airplane, giving it a start to start lifting up towards above the clouds. So thank you very much for that.